I will see you shortly. Bye, everyone. Good luck.
See ya. Forgot to count. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another virtual event with Calyptus. Thank you very much for joining us. We are Web3's hiring platform, helping people all over the world find jobs in the space and supporting some of the very best employers in our industry to speed up and reduce the cost of their hiring efforts. Today, we are diving into what it means to lead in Web3, a space where traditional models are being redefined and new approaches are appearing. Our panelists have a wealth of experience leading teams and driving innovation within the space, and they'll be speaking to some fundamental questions. How does Web3 leadership differ from Web2? What role do transparency and community play in guiding leaders' decisions? And as AI and automation advance, how might they redefine the role of a leader? From balancing the values and transparency with strategic decision-making to navigating the dynamics of both community and corporate stakeholders, we'll explore how leadership in Web3 challenges, adapts, and transforms the very concept of authority. So let's kick off by hearing from our panelists, who will each introduce themselves, their roles, their experience leading in the space. Adrien, are you happy to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the intro. I guess, Adrien, I spent the last almost 3 years now, come up to 3 years as talent director for Windranger Labs. So that was initially building out what was previously the BitDAO portfolio, and eventually moved towards Mantle Network and its sort of suite of products, as well as still supporting other portfolio projects from the sort of BitDAO sort of portfolio, like Game 7. So yeah, so been in the space of 3 years. Previous to that, was at a startup for about 8 years. Grew them from 15 to 1,200. So that was good fun.
Not too shabby. Johnny?
Yeah, so I've been in the talent space, I guess, for the last 17 odd years, which probably shows my age a little bit now. But had the pleasure of working with Adrien in the technology company I was talking about before, which was great fun and excitement, sort of building that business out. And then I joined Chainlink Labs around about 1.5 years ago now. So I've been building teams across Web3 since sort of summer of last year. It's been a sort of huge learning curve, kind of stepping into this industry and seeing the differences of how sort of Web3 works versus Web2 and some of the nuances there. But yeah, been a really fun journey, and sort of looking forward to where it continues going from here.
Cool. Antony, over to you.
Thank you. So yes, my name is Antony. I'm the VP of People and Operations at Parity Technologies. It's my first time in Web3. I've been in it now for 2.5 years. Feels suspiciously much longer than that. I look after a whole series of teams across the People and Operations functions at Parity. And prior to joining and sort of like immersing myself in Web3, I was a COO for many years across various industries and organizations of different sizes, from many, many thousands to startups.
Awesome.
Guess I'll round this out here. Oh my gosh, Antony, you and I are kindred spirits here. Basically, I have a very similar background to Antony, SVP of BizOps here at Restivo. This is my first Web3 venture as well. I've been in the space now for about 1.5 years. Prior to this, I've been leading operations for small to medium-sized businesses for the past probably 15 years at this point. Most of my career has been in the cybersecurity space, either on the consulting side of the business or on the product side of the business.
Great. Joe, let's stick with you for the first question. There was quite a bit of chatter there already about the differences between Web3 and traditional tech. For you, what are those key differences, and are there any challenges that arise or that are particularly different?
No challenges at all, Caleb. Actually, I have to say, having a lot of experience in the Web2 space, there are significant similarities when it comes to leading teams and leading organizations between Web2 and Web3. I think probably the biggest surprise for me over the past year and a half at this point is how consensus-driven decision-making is done, at least within Risk Zero. And I think for leaders in the space, you have to go in wide-eyed with this idea about consensus decision-making, because it requires a lot of mental and emotional energy to get it done right. There's that saying, too many cooks in the kitchen, and I have seen that play out firsthand when you want to be as inclusive as possible within decision making. So how have we kind of tackled that within Risk Zero? We do it in a couple of different ways, but the key way is that we expect everyone internally to have an opportunity to disagree, but then commit to this decision. So disagree, voice your concern, but ultimately commit to what the consensus of the organization does. And I'd encourage, leaders in this space to both model that behavior, voice your concerns about a particular decision, but if the corpus of the team believes it's the right approach, you need to go all in and you need to be supportive of that decision. That's the key, thing that I've noticed between Web 2 and Web 3. And I would just say the Web 3 dynamics about globally distributed teams. The fact that I'm in the US and I'm the minority on this call is a standard within the Web 3 space. It was a bit of a culture shock for me personally.
Yeah, I'll kind of add something there as well. Like the main things I've learned is just sort of that layer of complexity between trying to drive decision making in sort of a globally distributed organization, right? And sort of similar to what Joe said there, you're trying to drive consensus. So you're bringing in a lot of different people. So you've got to have lots of asynchronous conversations, lots of live meetings, just to kind of get to a certain outcome. But it's sort of, I also find that what it's enabled is a level of ownership on top of that, where sort of people can try and drive stuff sort of within teams sort of earlier on, and sort of trying to bring people in a bit later on in the conversation. But the biggest difference there between sort of Web 3 and Web 2 I see is that in Web 2, decision making tends to be or is often less complex, right? You have sort of a structured top-down and localized approach, which kind of makes things a bit easier to kind of get things done sort of, what you would think is faster. But even with that consensus, I find that in Web 3, things are just moving so quickly that people are always available, right? And time zones tend to not get too much in the way. It's just about finding the right people to connect with at the right time. But it's a pretty tough one to get your head around when you first move into the industry.
Yeah, I'd second that. I'd say just to add to that, there are some organizations that have that consensus by design as well. So like I've worked with a few DAOs over the last few years, and it's interesting because a lot of the time there's not necessarily a single CEO or a single point of decision making where someone says you must disagree or commit, and so a lot of that decision making or the ultimate decision lies with a group of people or a set of responsibilities that often are decentralized, which I think brings complexity, but also brings some sort of like experimentation that we can play with different tools and systems that allow us to try and work out some of these structures, because I guess DAO doesn't necessarily mean full chaos. Like there is a level of chaos we must embrace, but there is also a level of structure that we can put in place and governance, and looking at how we can make sure that like some of those roles and responsibilities are relatively as clear as they can be. But yeah, I can definitely see that, like, regardless DAO or not DAO, there's definitely a common thread in the Web3 space.
One thing I would kind of add to this is that the workforce itself, its constituency is somewhat different from anything I've ever experienced anywhere else. And you kind of, Adrien just referenced the term that we all hear quite a lot, chaos. And I think it's fascinating because, of course, we're in a space which is where work is pioneering on all fronts, philosophically, even legally, technologically. There are so many things which are outstanding and require very creative minds. But it also is a pull, a magnet for a different type of individual that wants to work within Web3, people who value things like agency individuals who are highly autonomous in general, very, very smart minds. I'm sure we've all been there where in the past, in previous organizations, we may well have been the smartest person in the room, and then you come into Web3 and you realize that's not the case anymore. And so you meet all these incredible kind of talents that are coming on board and working together on those on the various projects that you're engaged with. But it also becomes then a very highly combustible and potent mix to manage, and it has very distinct characteristics which single it out as being filled with challenges that you don't necessarily encounter kind of everywhere. And this comes down to kind of org creation, to the workforce kind of sentiment and so on. And it's, for me, it's been super fascinating because I've seen behaviors I've not seen before. I've seen people solution and organize themselves in ways which I've never seen kind of anywhere else. So it's also a very interesting field to get into as a leader or would-be leader.
Yeah, I just want to double down on that, Antony. I've met the most principled individuals I've ever worked with in this industry, for good or for bad. I'll say that everyone is quite principled.
And guys,
sorry, go on, Callum.
No.
I was just gonna add one of the biggest like glaring things that would, at least when I came into Web3 in my experience, was communication channels. I was always very used to everything going through like email or Slack. But then it just so happens that the abyss of Telegram, Signal, and all sorts of other messaging systems just come about. And I don't know if anybody else had that experience, but I ended up being in like at the start of the organization where people would just use 3 or 4 different comms channels, which makes it quite challenging because you know, when we are talking about driving through consensus and principled workforces, managing those discussions and trying to drive by consensus when everything is even more decentralized by the tools themselves makes it even more challenging. Sorry, Callum, I interrupted you.
No, I definitely faced that challenge. And the problem is I seem to speak with the same people on multiple different platforms. So I know I've spoken to someone about something and I can't for the life of me find where it is. Normally on Discord when I'm lost. But yeah, I was going to say and we touched on globally distributed teams. The vast majority of roles in Web3 are remote. And it'd be interesting to hear if any of you have experience working in the space and it not being remote, but the vast majority certainly are. How does leadership change when building and nurturing globally distributed teams? Are leaders still absolutely necessary, or do you think they have a slightly different purpose in this environment?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, thank you. I think it's an interesting kind of question. You can approach it from a lot of perspectives. So whether you want to kind of tackle it from some of the other kind of angles like risk and recruitment, retention, and tooling, and so on. But I think working with a globally distributed workforce is not unique to Web3. You see this kind of everywhere. So a lot of the challenges that you encounter, whether it's going to be too many tools, not enough tools, these are things which you invariably kind of encounter in so many different industries. What is for me really fascinating here is the concept of leadership, and what do we mean by it? I think it's a broader phenomenon within Web3 than it is within Web2 or other industries. Traditional classical leadership, as in people or corporate leadership, I mean, it's not going away anytime soon, but it also kind of manifests itself very differently within Web3. You can achieve leadership or be a leader via the IC route or through the community. For us, for example, the community through decentralization initiatives can essentially become the voice of your movement. And for us, of course, the leadership, you know, the way which we look at it at Parity is it's very horizontal. So in that respect, it is actually quite distinct and different from anything I've ever experienced before. So conceptually, it's not quite something I've ever encountered, but you know, you adapt to it and you see the value that comes from this particular structure. Then I think when you kind of draw it back and you look at kind of like working with, you know, leadership as in managing an entire Web3 organization or just teams of people, then I think that leadership does, you know, with a globally distributed kind of workforce, take on a different aspect within this environment. And I think I tried to bucket it up into 3 or 4 kind of like key areas. One is operationally. I see the role of a leader within Web3 to enable that primary constituency of your workforce, or your engineers, or whoever it is that essentially is there to drive your mission through, to be able to work and to focus without distraction. So you're here to clear away all the corporate nonsense and the other things that get in their way. You have to also be an agent of change when it comes to accountability. And that's especially important in remote first environments, because that's easier said than done. Very easily, it can descend into absolute agency without any responsibility. I think even more important is that you need to have a very strong unifying culture proposition. That has to be kind of underpinned by a common purpose and a sense of community. And I think where you go with this is you try to kind of add level. So, okay, well, how do you make all this happen? Well, you underscore it with agreed values, team retreats, company retreats, regular cadence on communication through all hands or whatever other kind of channel that you choose to kind of engage with. At Parity, we have team members in 40 countries or thereabouts, employees in 5 different countries, clear and effective communication, and plenty of collaboration opportunities are like essential for us to build a cohesive culture. But the one thing that really screams is being really different here around leadership within Web3, and it's something which I think is maybe not spoken of enough, but is actually really important, is the concept of humility. I never really encountered that so much elsewhere, certainly not in finance. When I was working in banking and other kind of industries, humility seems to be something which is kind of central to leadership within, certainly within our movement, and I'm sure kind of like broadly within Web3. And you realize that you are the supporting act, not the other way around. In other industries, the hierarchy determines the notion of impact and importance, or it believes it does. But in Web3, that just clearly isn't true. And so the value is the mission to be achieved, and your job is to help people get there. So I think it's some similarities, some things are different, but it's, again, as kind of before, I think working with globally distributed teams are not necessarily in itself particularly challenging if you can understand what the obstacles are. But I think understanding what your role as a leader, working with Web3, working with globally distributed teams, brings with it a different set of problems.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. A strong +1 on the humility angle, Antony. I think there's a form of leadership that I personally follow called servant leadership, which is quite accurately what you're describing here, where my role in the organization is not for my own self-enrichment. It is for the benefit of those that I serve, and how best do I enable them to be successful? Because ultimately, their success is the organization's success. When I think about like our role as leaders in the organization, it is to provide some amount of purpose for and inform that purpose for individuals so that they know that the work that they do each and every day has value. And I think, especially when you're globally distributed, every individual, if they can look to the work that they do, understand it has broader implications to the whole of the organization, so much less micromanagement and oversight required, right? This is why I love a lot of the lessons I learned within the Web2 space, but there are core techniques and frameworks that we can pull from in the Web3 space that are tried and true. Things like OKRs as an example. So within Restivo, right, we have key goals that we're striving for every quarter. Those are set at the leadership level, at the top level, but every team and every individual has their own set of OKRs that they're driving for, and they can see the trail from their goals ultimately to the organization's goals. It ensures that teams are working on what's important, which is, the execution of the day-to-day work that needs to happen. So highly agree with you, Antony, on all your points.
I was going to add, because there were some interesting pieces there, but, like looking at, moving away from micromanagement and these sort of techniques, I think sort of what I noticed being in sort of a global environment is you operate more as like a facilitator. You're sort of aligning and empowering over directing, right? And I think that's like a key thing to think about, because what you're trying to drive is a level of ownership in everything everybody does. Because that way, when someone is sat, remotely at home in an office on their own, they still need to feel that sense of ownership to be able to get their work done at their highest level. So it's about how you sort of enable, break down those barriers as a leader, drive better sort of connections within your teams, and then essentially sort of making people just feeling that sense of connectivity to the work they're doing. And if you do that, and then it links back to your mission, you actually really gain increased productivity from everyone across the board, rather than, you know, sat in a shared space where you're sort of on top of someone trying to make sure you understand what they're doing at every moment and every time. Here it's a lot more about trust and openness to people just to get stuff done. They know they can come to you when they need to be unblocked or need sort of support on anything. But I think that's kind of the key things that stand out, and sort of probably link back again to some of the things you were both saying.
Yeah, and I think one synergy with I guess startups in general is just the idea of over communication, like just the take on from what you're saying there, Johnny, and the rest of the panel. I guess things like OKRs, strategy, direction, different time zones, different missions, purposes. Like I think one of the things that would benefit both a Web 2 or Web 3 organization, but even more in Web 3, given that we've got a lot of those challenges and obstacles, is just the act of just, it when in doubt, just over communicate. And if it's in a meeting, or if it's in an email, or if it's just dropping a Slack message, Telegram, Signal, all of Discord, you know, there's so many ways to do that. But it's always like being very pragmatic and think over, you know, I can't over communicate anything more than it needs to be, other than just obviously you know, adapt to the style of the team and the rest. But yeah, with different, especially with very autonomous workforces, people tend to also just quite easily get siloed and just go off on their own tangents. And sometimes, you know, as leaders, we do need to bring them back towards, okay, let's remember, what are the OKRs, what are our targets, and what is the mission? Doesn't mean we need to micromanage them and tell them what to do. Just remind them of, hey, that's the North Star, and we all want to go there together. So yeah.
Two slight asides. One for you, Adrien, on this idea of like over communication. Wonderful story called American Icon, which talks about Alan Mullally's running of the Ford Motor Company. And what stuck out to me during his executive conversations is he started every executive meeting with what his role is in the company and what the mission of Ford Motor Company is, every single time. It's big campy, right? But it reiterates the fact of like, what the hell are we here to do as a business? So that's one thing. And then Johnny, on the facilitator piece and our role as facilitators, I don't know who needs to hear this, you know, within the audience, but one of the major challenges for me from moving from an IC to a leadership role is, how do I see my worth and my output? Because in an IC role, I see the widget I make, right? Because I make the widget. And now I see what my team ultimately makes. And that is a hard change for folks to navigate. So just, if you are transitioning into a leadership role, just know that you're going to feel some tension internally on like, what is my worth? What is my value? Because I'm no longer doing the thing. I need to live vicariously through my team and how I facilitate and enable them.
It's I was just to add to that, James, it's a really good point, right? You're sort of, as you move into leadership, you're trying to determine that gap between like getting out of the weeds and sort of into the sort of higher level, more strategic stuff to kind of enable your team and grow them. But actually, what I found again on the flip side is when you're in early stage organizations, especially in a very nascent industry, you get pulled in as well. So I think that's another challenge as a leader that you kind of really have to think about in this industry. It's like, you know, you need to be willing to get your hands dirty, roll your sleeves up and get involved, but also not just tell people the answer to the problem, or, you know, but really kind of guide them and help them. And I think, yeah, it's a piece that always plays on my mind. And I think about it all the time, and I always try and go too deep. And I know that, and I'm aware, and I sort of have to self-reflect and pull myself out of those situations. And it's a tough one. I think it's tougher in this industry than it has been previously.
Yeah, and to pull back on the thread of humility that Antony brought up, I guess is also having that humility as a leader to recognize and be vulnerable when we don't know things, and when we are, you know, adapting as leaders, and being open with our team and transparent around, you know, what challenges we're coming across with our team, because ultimately that helps us build that level of trust with our teams, and also that it's okay for them to also not know the direction that they're always going in, because that's also a big part of the ambiguity and the uncertainty around that surrounds Web3 and a lot of the products and the teams that we're building, especially as people are, like we've mentioned before, cross time zone, you know, different backgrounds, different cultures. So yeah, just recognizing that as the org evolves, like it's okay for our leaders to have that level of humility and vulnerability around that as well.
I think that's really, really good advice. I've seen a lot of young leaders in the space, owing to the autonomy and the ownership that people can take from very early in their careers. If you do that well, you over communicate, you have high agency, very quickly you can become a leader and be running really huge businesses. So yeah, I think all of that was fantastic advice. I suppose the next question, for me, and I'm sure for you as well, transparency and openness are really core values of Web3. Johnny, perhaps, do you think that these values underpin or uphold leadership? And how do you try to balance these ideals, these values, with ultimately decision making?
Yeah, so it certainly does, right? So as kind of I mentioned before, like a transparent leadership style within sort of these decentralized environments will encourage ownership and enable, team members to really feel like they're part of that shared mission. So the way I think about it is, again, sort of probably repeating a bit, but ownership drives productivity and high standards as team members have a stake in those decisions and they're kind of part of those communications, consensus, and sort of bringing people involved. So creating an environment where voices are heard, they're listened to, really kind of empowers like meaningful contributions across a group and a team and an organization in general. So when I think about how you balance that between sort of, driving, strategic decisions or even making quick decisions, it's a tough one, right? Because in theory, what I would always try to do is involve my team in each step, right? So if I'm going to drive a change, I want their input because they're enablers of that change. So I've got to balance those things with like, async conversations, real-time collaboration, and these things are going to take a while. So when I think about like, if there's a quick decision that I need to make and, I can't really bring people in because it's going to slow me down, I will obviously clarify the urgency to kind of make sure it's the right thing I need to do, but I'll ensure everybody understands the why behind the choice, right? And I think once the kind of change has been done, and I emphasize that because if you're launching some kind of initiative, the likelihood is you need your team to enable or to really help drive the enablement of that initiative in flow it out to the business, make sure people are using it, make sure it's in action. So it kind of takes me back to the point of like trust driving ownership ensures like everybody understands the rationale, and in turn this drives trust in the outcome itself, and then you have a team of people that kind of really believe in it, they'll move it forward. So the idea is always bring people along, be open, be honest about what's going on, but sometimes you do just have to make decisions quickly, and it's for the own good of the team or the business and that side of it. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
I think what I would kind of like add to this really is that we know that transparency is a core tenet of Web3. So I think if you find yourself in leadership, you need to kind of embrace that particular attribute. I think to a certain degree we need to, to quote our founder and the guy who coined the term Web3, Dr. Gavin Wood, we need to trust less, but that means transparency must be like accompanied with integrity and honesty. That's not the same as credibility or blind faith in authority, which I think can sometimes happen. So it means making more robust decisions, maybe not kind of being so gut with your instincts. I really like what you just said, actually, Johnny, about, for example, listening. I don't think we do enough of that sometimes. And I think it's important, to recognize that Web3 is quite a noisy environment. It's a lot of white noise sometimes, and you have to be able to cut through it. And you have to make sure that you're not in a little bubble or echo chamber where all you ever hear is the same voices over and over again. Good leaders empower others to be able to speak to make sure that they can find their voice in an organization, that you give opportunities no matter who they are. There are just so many wonderful minds and great people that you're working with. You should go out of your way to actually see what those opinions are. And I think also just solicit feedback as a leader. See how good are you at being transparent? See what people have to say. Is your communication as strong as you think it is? There's always something to kind of learn here. But I think the more I kind of realize that as an organization, we've been kind of through quite a journey where ultimately we're now in the process of communication. So very much back to kind of what we were saying before about kind of like over communication. I think it's not a bad thing at all, especially if you're communicating with purpose around what is important. You don't want to be just talking endlessly about things which frankly are just, you're just using up airtime. What is the point of this? Discuss things which actually mean something. Your entire culture rests on in many ways, not just kind of your overall value proposition, but also how open and transparent you are being with everyone. So I think, I do very much believe in this whole idea of just not blind faith in authority. Just because you are a leader doesn't mean you should be necessarily listened to. So I think another way of looking at it is you won't be listened to as soon as you could be proven that your I suppose your decision-making abilities are not as strong as you think that they are.
Yeah, completely agree. And there's so many common threads with all this as well, right? When we come back to having different cultures and being able to hire people globally and remotely, where there are some cultures that would react differently to voicing their own opinions in certain situations. And I think it's important to go, solicit those opinions when and good leaders will make sure that everyone has their own voice in their own way. And if it's not necessarily on a call, it might be on a Slack message or an email, or in different ways of putting those points across, and all part and parcel of building an inclusive culture.
The only thing I'll add to this, I think, is to recognize that leaders, especially if you're in a position of high authority, you live in a privileged position of information. Like, you have insight into most of the machinations happening within the business and the health and state of the business. And I think recognizing that's important, because many other individuals on the team are instead in a position where they have an information vacuum, and they fill that vacuum with their own ideas about what is happening. So I think when I think about transparency specifically, it is important to be empowering your team with the relevant information so that they can make informed decisions in their own day-to-day, but also that, their mental health is in a good state. You're telling them straight. I think, Antony, I can't remember what you had said, but like, it triggered the word integrity in my brain, that we are operating as a business of integrity, and I'm a leader of integrity, and what I tell you is the truth, good, bad, or indifferent. So I would encourage you all to, all the leaders in the room, especially ones that have information, that you share with your team, and you share it widely, not through back channels. I think the analogy that works well here is, we've all seen horror movies, and the scariest horror movies are the monster you don't see and what your brain fills in the gap. So just keep that in mind, I think.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that is, as well as like sharing openly, I think Antony, you mentioned it as well, but it's being open to feedback, having real like constructive conversations and dialogue. I have sort of this thing about, I like to ask people, like, what am I doing too much of, right? Where do you want to see less of me, and what do you want more of me? Like, I need to know what's going on in your head when we have conversations and we sort of work together, so I know how to shape my style to make sure that you're getting the best out of me, to enable you to do the best things as well. So I think the feedback piece is so critical here, on top of the openness, and that drives the right relationship.
100% agree, Johnny, on that. We also need to have mechanisms for people to provide anonymous feedback. And I think this is like the counter to the transparency piece. Like, not everyone feels super comfortable to tell their boss, you're doing this crappy thing over here. So having those venues for anonymous feedback is super important.
And I think a lot of our projects and products and our industry in general is very community driven. I'd say that is a big I'd say there are definitely a lot of Web2 companies that are community driven, but I'd say there's a big proportion of Web3 that is very like community impactful. And so I guess act internally as you would externally, because communities externally expect you to be transparent with them and as much as you can be, obviously, and solicit feedback about your product and improve the way in which you're delivering a given service. And so I think it would only be fair for that also to happen internally. And so using the sort of like core tenets of, I guess, what blockchain should be, which is transparent by design. Ultimately, it would be hypocritical to only have that as an externally facing thing and not also like, thinking about how to make sure that we deploy those things with our own teams and people.
It's the perfect segue, Adrien, into the next question around community. And community is so important in this industry, but as leaders, you obviously have to balance that with the boardroom. So Joe, what is more important to the success or failure of leaders in Web3, and how do you navigate community versus boardroom? I've certainly seen many successful and many not successful projects kind of lean both ways.
The framing of that question, it's interesting. I was almost hearing like that this is a zero-sum kind of relationship, and it actually is not in my head. And I think if you do this right, you can satisfy the needs of both of those stakeholder groups. And I think it all comes down to priority and how you focus as an organization, top down, on the priorities of your business. I think as a Web2 example, Costco's code of ethics. You're gonna be like, Costco, where's Joe going with this one? Their code of ethics, I think every business should just copy paste it into their own code of ethics. The way that it's phrased, if memory serves, they have their mission statement to provide the best goods at the cheapest price for their members. And their code of ethics says, in order to do this, first, we have to obey the law. Next, we have to respect our members, which is their customers, is what they call their members. Next, we have to respect our suppliers. Okay, so these are their vendors. And if we do all of these things, we'll realize our goal of returning shareholder value. Right? And they're a public company, so that's ultimately what they need to do. But it's very clear in the way that Costco does their business that they focus on what's important first, which is following the law, taking care of their customers, taking care of their employees, taking care of their vendors. And if they do all of those things, naturally, their shareholders will receive value. So I think similarly, this is how leaders in Web3 should approach, the dynamics of engaging with, if they have their VC backed, engaging with their VCs, engaging with the boardroom, engaging with the community who's using their technology, is that focus first on doing right, focus then on your customers and your employees, focus on your vendors, and then everything else will take care of itself. It feels a bit reductionist, but it actually does work in the long run. I stumped the panel. I did it.
You did.
The perfect answer. Is that it, Antony?
It's just hard to disagree with you, Joe, frankly.
Costco example threw everyone off.
Just on the note of Costco, they drink the Kool-Aid within this organization. It is a great data point on long-term retention of employees. Almost everyone within Costco starts within a warehouse and is hired and promoted within to higher and higher levels within the organization. They very rarely hire from outside the company, unless it's a specialized role, like they need to hire a GC or an attorney or something along those lines. So that's also something to think about and emulate. How can you look at your employees and develop them into the next thing that you will need 6 to 12 months from now, as long as it aligns with what their long-term career prospects are? You do that, you're going to have employees that are not just devoted to the organization and want to stay within the organization, but are also devoted to the mission and making sure customers are well taken care of.
Stumped us again. I guess just on the community piece though, just how we can relate that to like talent leaders is some things that we've done in the past and we've thought of is when we're looking at roles is actually putting out those roles 2 weeks in advance to the community first, and actually bringing that value to the community and saying, hey, you're part of this community. It's like an exclusive group. Like, you know, we want people to join. Like, why don't we put it out to our community first and see if there's anybody within that community that we want to give the opportunity to join us before we then start going externally and doing searches ourselves. And I guess that what that also brings is just to reinforce the importance of things like candidate experience and the experience that you're giving to your community in general, because ultimately, even if they don't become a full-time member or, you know, employee or whatever it might be, they're still a member of your community. And it's something that we, or Johnny and I, the previous company that we worked at, we already, despite it being in Web 2, working in a games company that ultimately the developers were building on our platform, but we were also trying to hire those same developers to build the platform. And so let's not lose lose sight of that and make sure that that we're ultimately like that community mindset transpires in every aspect of the things that we do. And that's kind of how it related to talent in particular.
For sure. I think it's a balance. It's always a balance, isn't it? And talking about hiring through the community, we recently made a hire through ours, and the onboarding process for him was so quick. He was up to speed in absolutely no time. He knew everything that we did before we even put any document in front of him. So yeah, huge advocate for using the community to help you grow as a business.
Can I just add really one quick point on this idea of hiring? And it is important when we hire that we go to various communities in the space that actually may be communities that are underserved by the Web3 space. But it is, if you do that as a strategy, and Adrien, I'm not sure if this was your train of thought, but if you do that and you find those individuals, it is also one thing. It's one thing to find them in the spaces where they congregate. It's another to ensure that the environment that you create within the business is conducive for them to stay, right? And I think back to my work in the cybersecurity space, and actually there's a lot of analogous. It's quite analogous to Web3 now. Barely any females within cybersecurity, and it's quite similar, right, within Web3. Look at this panel right now as an example. And I think it's incumbent upon us that if we are hiring from these other communities, especially these minority communities, that we create an environment internally that also is conducive for them wanting to stay. And that's almost the harder challenge than finding where they are. So.
For sure. And moving the conversation on to tech and AI. Antony, do you think the adoption of I suppose automation, AI, will change the role of leaders? And if you do, how do you think it changes?
Yeah, I suppose it's like understatement of the century. I think it already is, and the momentum is quickly building. I think like blockchain, it's a pole star within tech, and the funding alone is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, according to the IDC, worldwide funding for AI by 2028 is set to reach $628 billion. Some say it is over $1 trillion. Whatever that number will prove to be, I mean, we're talking something which is globally impactful, and we're already feeling those changes. When I was thinking about this particular question, I tried to reduce it a little bit. And so there's several kind of schools of thought, which I would love to just briefly talk about the impact of AI and how it will help to redefine leadership. And they are like automation opportunities, replacement theory. I don't know if it's called that, but it's what I called it. Improvement in general, and then like a nod towards like EQ. I mean, the automation opportunities are just kind of obvious. It will make basic tasks more efficient and less labor intensive. I mean, Parity, for example, I'm sure we're not unique. All you guys, no doubt, have done exactly the same. We already make use of various kind of AI functionality within Asana, Notion, many other tools, including our new HRIS humans. We've also kind of specifically chosen an ATS that offers us some very useful AI features around reducing bias in applicant screening. So what you just said there, Joe, about looking at the makeup of your organization and its underrepresentation. This was in the back of our mind. How many good people are we accidentally filtering out? Is it problem-free? No, of course not. It's is in its infancy. That's not a reason to not engage with it, though, of course. And by replacement theory, I think what I mean by that is that kind of that fear that AI will lead to replacement of large swathes of human industry. And how do we respond to it? I mean, that threat is likely to be grossly exaggerated, and it doesn't take into account what is likely to happen on a nation state level when they just throw one obstacle after another, in its way. I think a more realistic interpretation is that AI will replace much labor-intensive work and provide us with insights and learnings in order to develop and retrain. And I think that moves on to that third bucket of improvement, which is namely the opportunities that it brings. I mean, to refine and improve the way in which we work and how we work with our teams. I mean, we help AI to improve via prompts and instructions, and we hopefully leave behind basic and mundane tasks, and we focus more where it matters, like on high value activities, the strategic initiatives, the creative undertakings, and so on, where the human element is still very much needed. I think it does kind of help to enhance us as leaders, but how I see that is it helps us to recognize the opportunity cost of just standing still, of being comfortable. And yes, it might be a little bit painful, but we need to kind of start exploring it. My only caveat, of course, is that don't be reckless. It's still fairly new, and it's important as leaders to make very, very good decisions about the introduction of AI functionality into your organization. I think the other thing I will say about this is that the advent of AI itself brings the human touch of leadership, into the foreground more than ever. I think we need leaders with high EQ. The World Economic Forum published a report this year which categorically stated that EQ, or high EQ, is the single most valuable attribute or skill that a leader can have today. And I think that imperative is growing simply because we need to be able to connect with our teams more and more, and in a meaningful way that can help them to thrive in an environment and a landscape which is constantly changing. So like a high EQ is paramount to kind of like navigating the world of AI safely.
There's a great answer, and I think as well, just to add to that, like when you think about replacement theory, and there's so many comments that go out online about this, and it's taking over jobs and so on. But I actually look at it as just like it's a productivity enhancer, right? I think about this how I use it, and yes, we have different tools we've implemented for like helping with applications, you said, reducing bias, these sorts of things. But I also think about, like, since working remotely, right, and not having people around that I can just bounce ideas off like freely, I've found that AI has been sort of a real kind of eye-opener for me, where I can almost like have something, AI sort of help question my thinking, right, and sort of validate some of the thoughts I'm having. Sometimes it feels like I'm having a conversation with the computer, which is crazy, but it's actually helped sort of evolve some of the things that come to mind, or even just sort of push them out by making me realize that they weren't great ideas in the first place. But I find it really helpful from that side. But then also, if we need to do like quick hit docs and things like that, it speeds up my productivity time by 10 or 20, right? It's absolutely brilliant, the things that I can get done within 10 minutes that might have taken me an hour and a half previously. So I find it really useful, and it enables me to then think about how I work with my team better, how I spend more time with them, rather than sort of stuck in mundane tasks that shouldn't be taking up that much of my time, essentially. But I think it's brilliant. I think it's one of the best tools that have come into our sort of into our space and sort of given us the ability to really push forward.
I would say I love what you just said, because I think it's not maybe spoken of enough, but it is AI, and engaging with it will help to grow your own critical thinking skills. because you're helping to develop it through engagement in lots of different ways, and therefore this is actually good for you in terms of also kind of like ensuring that you are someone, you know, capable of good decisions, that you're able to examine, to critically examine yourself, as well as the work that you're actually engaged in. It has a lot of promise, but we also know, yeah, there's a lot to be concerned about, to be worried, and to not to kind of go into this kind of like blind, you know, for example, with this whole unconscious bias kind of screening that we're looking at, you know, through applications. Well, of course, if it is stating, you know, that this is like bias free, well, of course, is only as bias free as the person who gave it the prompts and information in the beginning, who may well be very biased. So it's a work in progress, but an incredibly interesting one. And I think, you know, any leader coming into Web3 or any other organization, this is going to be transformational for everyone. Hopefully we'll all have enough time to catch up with it.
Yeah, and I was going to add, I guess our role as leaders, coming back to the original topic, is to make sure that we're using it day to day with that balance, because I've definitely seen an influx, whether it's candidates interviewing or, you know, people in the team writing documentation, maybe going sometimes too far that way, where we're reliant on using AI for documentation because it's just the easy thing to go and do. So I think our role as leaders is to also make sure that we're there to call on the team when we do think we're going the wrong direction with how we're using it. But yeah, I mean, like the manual processing of data, for example, of being able to just like digest information very quickly and summarize it, and thinking about like how we're strategically positioning the narrative of whether it's a hiring report or a strategic like point that we're trying to get across in for a community or a boardroom. I guess there's definitely a huge amount of advantages, and it's a very powerful tool. It's just like how we use it is definitely needs a balance.
Yeah, I'll just round out the conversation. I totally agree with you, Adrien, and actually it impacts your integrity and your credibility if you're using the tool as a crutch. People know, right? So I'd encourage everyone not to do that and use it only as, you know, some sort of thought starter, and that's it, and then you build upon it. And then, oh my gosh, Antony and Johnny, you guys gave me some flashbacks to some of my first conversations when I became a manager, where I was getting quite frustrated with the amount of time I was focusing on people issues and people management. And a leader I remember to this day said to me, your role now is 10% your job description, your work that you're required to do, and 90% people management. So I think AI is a tool in which gives you back more time to focus on the people, right? And it allows you to focus on what's important. And Antony, you brought this up, like EQ, and like make sure you're connecting with your team at a deeper level. Use AI to give you back more productivity time. Focus that time on your team.
Great stuff. Final question from me, and then we'll go over to maybe a couple of audience questions. What skills and qualities should emerging leaders nurture to thrive in Web3? Are traditional leadership skills becoming obsolete in any sense, Adrien?
I think we've touched on so many of these points already, and it'd be interesting to try and summarize some of them and how they relate to leaders in Web3. But clearly, a lot of Web2 experiences are transferable. You know, being a manager is not just about being a manager in Web3, and even being a manager for 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, different people with different EQs, different backgrounds. It obviously takes a lot of, you know, practice and experience to make perfect, and for some it comes easier than others. But I think to unpack some of the skills and qualities that we've looked at, I guess one is, how do we create and foster an environment that drives people towards like company mission and objectives? And you know, that's for some companies that means flatter organizations or more autonomous environments. For other teams, you know, they depending on the people they have, it's not as productive. But I guess as a leader coming into new environments, if you are new to Web3, or if you're new to leadership in the Web3 context, embrace it, I think, and adapt to it. Don't try and bring previous baggage just because that's what you have to a new environment. I think it's the idea of like experimenting around flatter structures, looking into DAOs, at least inform yourself, research, and try and make sure that there's that sort of, like I said, not bring sort of the baggage with you, and looking at bringing some level of operational structure as well, because it doesn't also mean that we just have to just totally follow the chaos where it goes. So yeah, but I think another one is that community mindset. Like making sure that we embrace that both internally and externally, and bring it together in ways that we want to experiment ourselves. We've touched on ethics. One way a lot of people get into Web3 is for ethical reasons, whether it's data privacy, financial freedom, decentralization. Use it, motivate your people with it. How link it to the company's goals and mission, and when the going gets tough, we've all been, I'm sure, at points in our careers where challenges, obstacles seem like they're never ending, and so I think it's a really important part of how we motivate people, and remind them for why they got into the industry in the first place, and hopefully the reason they got into or joined the company isn't contradictory to that. Otherwise, it probably shouldn't have been hired for that organization in the first place. Transparency, clearly, another one. Again, by design, bring people along on a journey, create that trust in a world where we're not always able to have in real life meetings all the time. Communication, over communication, different tools, different structures, different organizations. Adapt yourself, but hold people accountable. And I think that's the biggest key point that I would make from this, is that often with that flexibility comes ambiguity, and comes that level of chaos. Well, hold yourself to account and show others that you're holding yourself to account through creating OKRs or visible things that you're doing and that you would like other people to do alongside that with you. Because decentralization doesn't necessarily mean that everyone does what they want. I guess it's about making sure that as leaders that we lead by example, particularly when people are remote, different time zones, may not necessarily join meetings. We come back to that idea of over communicating or driving action points, and making sure that meetings don't just last an hour and just end without really people knowing what they have to go and do afterwards, because it's really easy to do that in a world on Zoom, Google Meet, or whatever new tools. And so yeah, that idea of holding people to account and creating that reliable structure where people can trust each other to go and deliver work, ultimately I think is like all important threads.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on to that is just be radically humble. You do not know all the answers. Be a student always. I encourage you, there's a lot to learn about historical leaders. So find leaders that resonate with you and read their story. Read how they built their teams and how they ran their teams. Not that you need to mirror it exactly, but that you get nuggets of wisdom, right, from them that you can then fold into how you are as a leader. This goes for some of the most powerful leaders in the world right now, especially in the business space. Folks like Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA, he literally reads business biographies every single week, and he's running one of the most profitable and biggest companies in the world. If he can do it and he's humble, I think we all can as well.
Yeah, I would maybe just add, I think between all of us, we could probably produce an enormous list of skills and attributes, that's kind of as long as War and Peace. But I think if I can add like a few extras to some of the great suggestions and points come up already, should be kind of obvious. Listening skills. Everything is to the max, it feels like, within Web3 in comparison to kind of what you see everywhere else. So it is not necessarily unique, but you need to have many of these qualities and skills in abundance. Self-accountability, very important. Empowering greater agency and rejecting micromanagement. Advocacy skills, critical thinking skills. You need to be deeply resilient. I think it's kind of easy to like break on the waves of Web3. It's really important to be resilient. Emotional intelligence, as we discussed before, excellence in communication. And the other thing I would add is like curiosity beyond your immediate horizon. Regardless really of your professional discipline, one of the things I love about Web3 is kind of the interconnectedness of the projects that you're working on. So why must you stay in your lane? You can express your curiosity in so many ways. You can work on other projects, you know, hopefully within your organization, maybe even further afield within your ecosystem. And leaders should encourage this kind of curiosity in others. And also, you know, I would expect kind of emerging leaders to really start to kind of take hold of that.
I also just want to recognize that I probably think we scared a lot of people because we just listed off 15 things you need to be amazing at. So I think what I would just say to everyone is everyone on this call at one time or another, maybe even now, has felt like an imposter, has had imposter syndrome. That is totally normal. It is okay. As long as you're trying and you're learning, keep going at it.
And are they obsolete? I guess I think, in my opinion, no. I guess it's having that humility to say that we're going to adapt to whatever situation, whether it's a Web 2, Web 3. We're all in this together, and just making sure that I guess we adapt to the environments that we're in, and we do our best to be the best version of ourselves, which is a very corny ending to that.
Yeah, I agree. Traditional leadership skills. Of course they're not obsolete. And Joe, I thought that was a great point. No one can be all of those things at once, but we can try. All right, everyone, that was fascinating, really interesting. From my side, at least, I felt I learnt. Thank you all very much for your time. We have run up on time, and I know a few of us have some other things to do after this. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you to the panel for espousing all that wisdom. Really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye all.